That isn't mine.
Then explain how it got into your bag.
Someone wants me silenced.
Wait, that's not right. I saw what you did.
The wallet was never the reason. They're looking for something.
Your daughter must be proud of you. It would be unfortunate if she heard about today from someone else.
How do you know about my daughter? What exactly did you record?
Enough to change everything. They never knew someone was listening.
Naomi Raines had barely set her coffee cup down when two officers blocked her table. They forced the black single mother to her feet, upended her bag across the cafe floor, and held up a wallet that didn't belong to her in front of a room full of strangers. Officer Nolan Voss smiled as he clicked the handcuffs shut, called her a thief, and asked whether her daughter knew what kind of woman her mother really was. Naomi couldn't explain how the wallet got there, but from a shadowed corner near the window, a homeless man quietly closed an old radio. He had recorded everything. Stay until the end, because that wallet was only one small piece of a scheme that had been quietly dismantling an entire neighborhood for years. The morning Naomi Raines walked into Bell & Finch, she carried a black canvas tote over her left shoulder, a notebook pressed under her arm, and the quiet weight of 3 weeks of work she hadn't shared with anyone yet. She was a contract auditor for a community development nonprofit, and someone had forwarded her a set of invoices. City-funded, publicly authorized, and wrong in ways that didn't announce themselves until you looked at the dates and the routing numbers 3 separate times. The source had agreed to meet her at 9:30, had confirmed the night before, and had not walked through the door by 9:45. Naomi ordered a second coffee, moved her phone closer to her cup, and pulled up the photograph she had taken of the documents. 7 pages of billing records from a private security firm called Sentinel Crest, all stamped with a city seal, all paid out of a fund labeled Urban Infrastructure Maintenance, and none of them describing services that matched the line items attached. She was not frightened yet. She was careful, which had always served her better. Officer Nolan Voss and his partner walked into the cafe at 10 minutes past 10, and the first thing Voss did was scan the room once before moving directly to Naomi's table, past a dozen other customers, without pausing to question anyone else. He said a patron had reported a missing wallet, that there had been a complaint, and that he would need her to stand away from her belongings for a moment. And when Naomi asked, with exact calm, what grounds they had to search her property, Voss tilted his chin and told her that her resistance was creating a situation that made her behavior look suspicious. His partner shifted to her left side in a way that had nothing casual about it, a half step that closed off the angle to the door. And Naomi understood then that this sequence had been arranged before either of them walked through the entrance. She stood up without being told twice, kept her hands where the room could see them, and said nothing more, because she was 35 years old and had spent a lifetime learning the precise geometry of these moments. When to speak, when to go still, and when the only remaining choice is to make sure the record shows you gave them nothing to use. Voss reached into her tote and removed its contents one at a time, laying each item across the table and letting some of them slide to the floor. Her personal wallet, a prescription bottle, a composition notebook, a photograph of her daughter in a school recital dress, her phone still lit with the invoice photographs, and finally a brown leather bifold that Naomi had never held in her life. A man seated 2 tables back, near the service counter, said immediately that it was his, said he had been looking for it since he arrived, and said he remembered seeing Naomi pass his table when she came in. She said she had not gone anywhere near him, said it looking directly at Voss, who was already unclipping his handcuffs, and the words were precise and completely useless, because the man near the counter was nodding with the mild, cooperative expression of someone who has rehearsed his role and found it comfortable. From the corner near the frost-edged window, a man in a worn jacket and a wool cap sat very still with a scratched transistor radio on the table in front of him. He was not watching the officers' faces or Naomi's expression. He was watching the tote bag, the angle of the zipper, and the direction the pull tab was facing, because it had flipped position since the moment Naomi had walked through the door. Voss turned Naomi toward the glass wall of the cafe, one hand steady on her upper arm, and asked whether she wanted to make everything harder for herself than it needed to be. She told him she was a contract auditor waiting for a professional meeting, that she had identification and a work record and nothing to hide, and Voss said people with nothing to hide generally didn't push back so hard against a routine inquiry. And then he picked up her phone from the table, unlocked the screen with a firm pressure she had no way to prevent, and looked at the photographs of the Sentinel Crest invoices for long enough that she understood the wallet was a pretext and the phone was the point. He closed the screen without a word and slipped the device into a plastic evidence bag, and Naomi watched him do it with the particular stillness of someone who has just recognized the full shape of what is happening and knows that protesting it aloud will not change anything. A customer near the front raised his phone, and Voss's partner moved toward him immediately, saying in a level, informational tone that recording an active police encounter could be considered interference with a lawful investigation, which was not precisely accurate, but was delivered with the authority of something that didn't need to be. Marlowe Bennett, the cafe manager, stood behind the counter with her hands folded below the register and did not speak. She had received 2 letters from the city's business licensing office in the previous 18 months, both citing technical violations that had resolved themselves after she cooperated with whoever came asking next, and she had drawn the lesson from those experiences that survival required a certain practiced stillness. Voss turned back to Naomi and said something quiet, directed at her specifically, about the complications that a felony arrest created for custody arrangements, and what a shame it would be for her daughter to hear about this from someone else first. Naomi felt something cold move through her chest, because she had never mentioned her daughter's existence to either officer during the encounter. And Voss had known, which meant someone had researched her, had identified her by name before they walked in, had found the specific lever most likely to produce cooperation. She did not say anything, and the effort of not saying anything was the hardest thing she had done in recent memory. In the corner, Gideon Price sat with his hands flat on the tabletop and tracked the man who had reported the wallet. Middle-aged, short gray jacket, a canvas duffel at his feet, and when that man rose from his seat and walked toward the exit with the unhurried ease of someone who knows the scene is complete, something small dropped from the side pocket of his bag and slid beneath the edge of Gideon's table. Voss led Naomi through the room and out the front door, and she looked back once, not at the officer, not at her scattered belongings, but at the corner where the man in the wool cap sat with his old radio and his eyes that had not missed a single movement. He did not call out, did not stand, and she turned away thinking he was one more person who had watched and let it happen, which was what she believed about nearly everyone in that room. And she was right about all of them except one. Gideon Price had been sitting near that window for close to 8 months, long enough that most of the cafe's regulars had stopped registering him as a person who required acknowledgement. He was 54 years old, wore clothes that had belonged to other people, and kept a transistor radio on the table that he rarely used for its original purpose because the radio had been modified to function as a recording device and had been collecting audio and environmental data in that corner since the spring. Before losing his apartment, his savings account, and whatever remained of a family that had grown exhausted waiting for things to stabilize, Gideon had spent 11 years as a surveillance systems technician for Sentinel Crest Security, installing and maintaining the camera networks that monitored the downtown commercial district, including the full interior of Bell and Finch. He had been terminated after filing an internal complaint about falsified maintenance logs, and the company had responded by filing a countersuit that consumed his legal savings before being dismissed. A victory that left him sleeping in a transitional shelter on Whitmore Avenue, and had taught him that being correct about something and being protected for being correct were not the same condition. He did not take the memory card to the police because he had spent 11 years working adjacent to municipal security contracts and understood exactly which departments maintained service relationships with Sentinel Crest and what those relationships permitted in terms of data access. Instead, he walked 6 blocks to a brick building on Clement Street and climbed 2 flights to the office of a civil rights attorney named Celeste Avery, who ran a small practice focused on housing and police misconduct and who had, on 3 occasions, organized food distribution at the transitional shelter, where Gideon sometimes had a bed. She opened the door, looked at the man standing in the hallway, and asked what he needed. Not who he was, not where he came from, just what he needed. And that single question told him she was worth talking to. Celeste listened to the full account without interrupting, and then did what honest attorneys do. She raised the hard objections immediately. The memory card could have been planted. The video it contained had no formal chain of custody. Gideon had a prior arrest record involving a trespassing charge at a public building. The opposing legal team would make his history the center of its opening argument. Gideon didn't argue with any of it. He laid out a sequence of observable facts in the order he had documented them. The time Voss's patrol car had parked on the east side of the block, the specific radio frequency used by Sentinel Crest field personnel, that he had been monitoring for weeks, the precise positions of the 4 cameras inside Bell and Finch, and the exact times they had gone offline 14 minutes before the officers entered, and the make, model, and partial license plate of the vehicle the man in the gray jacket had used when he left the scene. Celeste wrote everything down, and when she finished she set her pen on the desk and said, quietly, that she recognized the company name because she had seen it recently in a different context, and asked him to spell Sentinel Crest. The company appeared on a set of city invoices that a contract auditor had been photographing on her phone when she was arrested that morning. Celeste made 2 calls within the hour, one to arrange bail and one to a colleague who handled emergency protective orders. And when Naomi Raines walked out of the county detention facility that afternoon and found a woman she had never met waiting beside a car, and a man standing a few paces back whom she recognized immediately as the person who had sat in the corner of the cafe and done nothing, she told him exactly what she thought, directly and without softening the words. Gideon said, if he had stood up while the officers were still in the room, they would have arrested him too, and the only thing that could prove her innocence would have disappeared into an evidence locker where no one with the right knowledge could act on it. Naomi looked at him for a long moment and then asked what, exactly, he had recorded. The 3 of them sat in Celeste's office until well past 7 that evening, and by the time they stopped talking, Naomi had filled a full notebook page with dates and addresses, and the names of limited liability companies she had never encountered during the official audit. The pattern was there. She could read it with the same part of her brain that caught transposed digits in budget spreadsheets. But the shape of it was considerably larger than she had expected, and the word scheme felt too small for what it described. In the previous 26 months, at least 11 people had been arrested within 4 blocks of the Bell and Finch intersection on charges that shared the same structural logic: petty theft, disorderly conduct, possession of allegedly stolen property, resisting without violence, trespassing on commercial premises. The arrest reports named an elderly man who had owned a dry goods store on that block for 19 years, a woman who had twice declined a buyout offer on the apartment above a flooring shop, a homeless veteran who spent his mornings near the corner bus stop, and 3 other small business owners whose properties sat within the footprint of a development application Naomi had photographed without fully understanding what she was looking at. Most of the charges had been dropped within 3 to 6 weeks, which looked like restraint until you understood what 3 to 6 weeks did to a business, a lease negotiation, a rental history, or a person's relationship with their employer. Gideon had maintained his own parallel record in a composition notebook, kept in the inside pocket of his jacket. License plates, badge numbers, observation times, weather conditions, pedestrian counts, with the patient, methodical attention of a man trained to document hardware systems who had applied that same discipline to the street outside his window. Naomi cross-referenced his notebook against her own audit files and found something that stopped her mid-sentence. Every significant increase in police activity in the corridor, every concentrated stretch of arrests and complaints, had preceded by between 3 and 7 weeks a property acquisition by one of 6 limited liability companies with addresses scattered across 4 states and no publicly visible connection to one another. Marlo Bennett arrived at Celeste's office 2 days later without being asked, sat down in the chair across from the attorney, and placed a folder on the desk. The folder contained copies of invoices that Sentinel Crest had billed to the Café for camera maintenance, each one corresponding to a remote access event that Marlo had noticed in her system log but had never fully investigated, along with a brief email exchange in which a Sentinel Crest account manager had made clear that the Café's participation in the city's commercial improvement grant program came with an expectation of network cooperation, language phrased as a courtesy reminder but carrying the weight of a condition. Marlo said she had asked a technician about the external access once and been told it was a contractual obligation tied to the grant, and that if she had further questions she should direct them to the city's Economic Development Office, which she had never done because the licensing letters had already taught her what asking inconvenient questions tended to cost. The email thread itself didn't use the words quid pro quo, but it described the arrangement with sufficient precision that the meaning was unavoidable to anyone reading it carefully. Celeste submitted a formal preservation request to Sentinel Crest's registered legal address and received, within 4 business days, a written response stating that all surveillance footage older than 90 days was subject to automatic deletion under the company's standard data retention policy. Gideon read the letter and told them the company's actual operational protocol, the one documented in the internal manual he had helped write, required 3-year retention of archived footage on a secondary backup server maintained for insurance dispute resolution, and that server was housed in a warehouse on Decker Industrial Road that he himself had wired in the spring, 7 years earlier. Celeste stated, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that neither Naomi nor Gideon was to set foot on that property without a court order in hand, because evidence gathered through unauthorized access would be inadmissible and would give the opposing legal team the single argument they needed to collapse everything else they had built. The preservation order was still pending in the court system, which meant there was a narrow interval during which the warehouse contents were in a legal gray zone, not yet under formal protection, not yet cataloged by anyone with authority to receive them, and theoretically accessible to anyone with the right key or the right mandate. Elias Grant, an investigative journalist who had been following anomalous land transfers in the downtown corridor for nearly a year, reached a former Sentinel Crest field technician through a source network he had developed during earlier reporting, and the technician confirmed without identifying himself that the company maintained off-site physical backup drives, specifically because one division was involved in insurance and liability work, requiring long-term record-keeping. On the 3rd evening after the preservation motion was filed, Gideon positioned himself at a coffee cart across the street from the Decker warehouse and watched a panel van with no company markings pull into the loading bay at 11:40 at night. 2 men climbed out, used a keypad entry, and began carrying equipment cases toward the vehicle. Gideon documented the plate number, the start time, the duration of the loading, and called Naomi rather than the police. Because Voss worked the overnight rotation for that precinct, and Gideon had matched the Sentinel Crest radio frequency to Voss's shift start times on 3 occasions in the previous month. Naomi passed the information through the nonprofit's network to a state records integrity inspector, whose jurisdiction covered public records tampering, and who had no formal relationship with the city department holding Sentinel Crest's contract. The court order was served the following morning, and when the state inspector's team entered the warehouse with a marshal, 2 server racks had been cleared, and multiple hard drive bays were empty. What remained was enough to establish the fact of the removal: drive labels, network router logs with timestamps, connection records showing access from an off-site administrative account, And one additional item the removal team had overlooked: a rack-mounted power supply in the rear of the third storage bay, a unit Gideon had installed himself, which he knew contained a secondary solid-state compartment behind the main battery housing, used for automatic configuration backups, written every 72 hours. The inspector's team extracted the drive from the compartment with Gideon's guidance, and found, among other records, 147 hours of footage from Bell and Finch spanning 14 months, including footage of the morning Naomi was arrested. Footage of the man in the gray jacket reaching into her tote bag from behind, while her attention was on her phone, and footage of Voss standing on the sidewalk outside the cafe entrance with his radio pressed to his ear, waiting before he walked in. On the same drive, 8 months earlier in the timestamp record, was a late evening segment captured after the cafe had closed. Sergeant Brent Callow and Commissioner Conrad Wexler, seated at a center table with a rolled document spread between them, a map marked in 2 colors, with circles drawn around properties at the same intersections where the 11 prior arrests had occurred. They were not arguing. They were pointing at the map and nodding, and the footage had audio. Naomi watched the recording 3 times before she allowed herself to describe what she was seeing. The circled properties on the map matched, at 7 distinct points, the development footprint submitted to the City Planning Commission by Blackwell Urban Development Group in a filing listed as preliminary, and therefore given almost no public attention when it was entered into the record. The targeted parcels were not scattered or random. They were the anchor properties of a proposed mixed-use corridor, a hotel site, a commercial retail strip, and 412 units of market-rate residential housing that the application described as replacing what it called underutilized urban stock. Naomi had processed enough redevelopment documents to understand the vocabulary. Underutilized urban stock meant buildings with people in them who couldn't afford to fight a well-capitalized developer. Elias ran the corporate registration records for the 6 limited liability companies that had purchased property in the zone over the preceding 2 years. The names were unremarkable, the addresses scattered across 4 states, and none of them publicly connected to Blackwell Urban Development. What they shared, buried 3 layers into the transfer documentation, was a single financial clearing account administered by a fund management company registered in Delaware, and the beneficial ownership of that fund, disclosed in a filing that required knowing which database to search and what to look for, was the Blackwell Family Holdings Trust. Elias had been attempting to close this connection for nearly a year without the right record. The county assessor documents Naomi had pulled that afternoon did it in under 2 hours. The mechanism of the scheme was not complicated, which was part of what had made it durable. Create the appearance of danger in the target zone. Document that danger through official police reports. Use the documentation to depress assessed property values. Purchase the parcels through companies that couldn't be traced back to the buyer, and announce the redevelopment only after acquisition was complete. The infrastructure that manufactured the danger, the staged arrests, the harassment campaigns, the camera manipulation, the recruited false witnesses, was financed through Sentinel Crest's city contract, which had been processed through Commissioner Wexler's office and renewed automatically for 3 consecutive years without competitive bidding. The cash payments to Callow, Voss, and the network of planted witnesses moved through a Sentinel Crest subsidiary that existed on paper only, dispersed as consulting retainers and security coordination fees. Thaddeus Blackwell called Naomi's cell phone directly on a Tuesday afternoon, a number he should not have had, and spoke in the unhurried register of a man accustomed to finding that problems, when met with the right figure, tend to resolve themselves. He said there had been a regrettable misunderstanding, that certain people in his organization had exercised poor judgment, and that he was personally committed to making things right. He offered to have her arrest record sealed, her contract reinstated with a formal apology from the nonprofit board, and a financial settlement he described only as substantial. And he mentioned, carefully and once, that her daughter's academic path was something he was in a position to support in meaningful ways. Naomi said nothing for a long moment, and Blackwell mistook her silence for deliberation. She said no. She said he was not offering to make things right. He was offering to purchase the right to continue doing this to the next person. He said she was making a very difficult choice, and she said she had already made it, and she ended the call. That evening, she told Gideon what had been offered. He asked, without judgment, whether she wanted her daughter to grow up believing that silence was the price of safety. Naomi said her daughter was going to learn something different. The response from the opposing side came within 72 hours and arrived in two forms. The first was a statement distributed to every local outlet. Gideon Price was described as a disgruntled former employee with a documented history of confrontational behavior, a prior arrest record involving public trespassing, and a personal vendetta against Sentinel Crest, framing his involvement as a coordinated attempt to leverage false grievances for financial gain. The second was an arrest. Gideon was taken into custody on a Thursday morning on a felony charge of destroying a traffic signal control box on the 400 block of Morrow Avenue, an act the police report placed at 2:17 in the morning on the previous Wednesday. The report cited a witness statement and a single frame of security footage showing a figure in a dark jacket near the site. Celeste filed a motion for emergency release before noon and requested the Public Transit Authority's GPS logs for Route 17. Because Gideon had been on a late bus that night, a run from the Whitmore Avenue Shelter District to the downtown transfer station, and transit vehicles maintained their own time-stamped location records tied to route card usage. The logs placed Gideon's transit card on a bus, traveling in the opposite direction from Morrow Avenue at 2:14 that morning, a 3-minute gap that made the charge structurally impossible. The witness statement, when Celeste cross-referenced the name against the Bell and Finch case file, belonged to the same man who had reported the wallet stolen 6 weeks earlier. 2 separate incidents, 2 separate defendants, 2 statements taken by officers from Callow's unit. Naomi visited Marlowe at the cafe and did not ask for anything. She sat across from her in the back office, among the supply invoices and the laminated health inspection certificates, and told her, plainly and without pressure, what had happened to the 11 other people arrested in that neighborhood over the preceding 2 years. The dry goods store owner, who had lost his lease during the 3 weeks his business ran without customers while a theft charge was pending. The woman who had stopped fighting a buyout offer after a trespassing complaint appeared on her rental history. The retired electrician who had agreed to sell his building for 62 cents on the assessed dollar after 2 of his regular customers were arrested inside it on the same afternoon. Marlowe sat quietly through all of it and said she had told herself that neutrality was how she protected the cafe, that if she stayed out of other people's situations, they would leave her alone, and that she had believed this because it had been partially true, because she had cooperated and the cafe had survived, and she had told herself those 2 facts were unrelated when they were not. Naomi said she understood, and she meant it exactly as she said it, with no edge beneath the words, and she stood up and left. Marlowe called Celeste's office the following morning and brought the full folder of Sentinel Crest invoices, the access logs, and the email thread that documented the terms of the grant arrangement. She said she had kept copies of everything because she had always kept everything, and she was done deciding which silence to maintain. Elias published a partial account that week, enough to establish the story in the public record without disclosing the full scope of the evidence, a calculated decision he and Celeste had made together to prevent the principals from identifying exactly what had been preserved and what had not. 3 days after the article ran, a message arrived in Celeste's encrypted case system from an unrecognized address. The sender identified himself as Patrol Officer Julian Reed, said he had been assigned to Callow's unit for 2 years and had on 2 occasions been instructed to file reports that misrepresented what he had directly observed, and said Callow was preparing to remove a physical ledger from his residence and transport it out of state within 4 to 6 days. Julian Reed was 29 years old, had joined the department with a specific set of beliefs about what the work was supposed to mean, and had spent 2 years watching those beliefs be treated as a professional liability by a supervisor who viewed honest documentation as an inconvenience. He would not appear publicly. He had a daughter in kindergarten, a mortgage, and a clear-eyed understanding of what happened to officers who testified against their departments before those departments had finished protecting the people at the top. But he told Celeste everything he knew about the ledger. A standard composition notebook, written in a personal shorthand Reed had partially decoded over months of proximity, containing records of cash disbursements, property target lists, camera shutdown schedules, names of recruited witnesses, and amounts paid. Callow was planning to move the ledger and associated data files out of the jurisdiction within the week. Celeste brought the complete file to Assistant U.S. Attorney Lenora Hayes, the warehouse footage, the property transfer records, the Sentinel Crest financial data, the Marlowe documents, and Reed's account. Hayes was not impressed in the sense of being moved by the narrative. She was interested in whether the evidence was structurally clean, whether the chain of custody would hold under adversarial examination, and whether any of the digital material had been accessed in a manner that would give a competent defense attorney grounds to argue contamination. She asked for 48 hours to have her office's forensic accountant review the financial records independently and ask Celeste to produce a written acquisition timeline for every piece of evidence. She also said, without inflection, that the ledger was the most critical remaining item, and that if Callow moved it across state lines, the case would still stand, but would take significantly longer to close. Naomi proposed a controlled disclosure. Through Reed, they identified an internal case management channel that Callow accessed regularly, and that was not encrypted, a system with known vulnerabilities that Gideon had flagged in his original Sentinel Crest complaint years earlier. They entered a single piece of information that was technically accurate but misleadingly specific. A reference to a full primary server recovery, reportedly yielding the complete original archive from the Decker warehouse. The information overstated what they had. It was constructed to sound like exactly the kind of development that would prompt someone managing a cover-up to act quickly. Within 17 hours of the disclosure, Callow issued a verbal order to Voss to retrieve what he called the hardware before a federal hold could be applied. Voss arranged to meet Douglas Farrell, the man in the gray jacket, a contractor who had been used for multiple setups across the operation, in a parking garage on the south end of the commercial district. Federal surveillance documented the meeting, the cash transfer, and the handoff of a device kit Farrell, described as designed for extracting data from law offices. Voss was arrested in the garage with the kit in his possession, and a secondary phone containing a text thread that referenced the Bell and Finch operation by date and described the phone seizure from Naomi as successful data containment. He said nothing for 3 hours. Then his attorney came out of the interview room and asked to speak with Hayes directly because Voss had decided that absorbing the full weight of a federal racketeering charge while Callow negotiated a reduced deal was not a situation he was willing to accept. He confirmed the Bell and Finch setup had been ordered to neutralize an audit that was approaching the Sentinel Crest payment structure too closely. He confirmed that Naomi's background had been researched before the operation and that the custody reference was a deliberate tactic intended to produce cooperation. He confirmed that Callow had final approval authority over all staged incidents. And he said the disbursement chain did not originate with Callow or with Wexler. The financial authorizations had been approved, line by line, through a chain that ran directly into the Blackwell Family Holdings Administrative Office. Federal search warrants executed simultaneously across 5 locations at 6:45 on a Wednesday morning. The administrative offices of Sentinel Crest Security, Brent Callow's residence, the Urban Development Commission's records office, the registered address of Crestline Holdings, and the Financial Compliance Division of Blackwell Urban Development Group. Callow was stopped at the entrance to a regional airport with a rolling case that contained, among other items, a composition notebook tucked inside the folded lining of a blazer, a forensic accountant working for the U.S. Attorney's office spent 11 hours with the notebook and produced a summary matching, entry by entry, the financial records Naomi had reconstructed from public fund transfers, amounts, dates, and recipient designations all corresponding to the payments. Sentinel Crest had logged as professional service retainers. Conrad Wexler appeared before reporters outside his attorney's office and stated he had authorized only standard public safety coordination and had no knowledge of any conduct exceeding the scope of normal law enforcement activity. His attorney ended the statement at 4 minutes, and by that afternoon the federal filing was public. 17 emails from Wexler's city account in which he had forwarded specific property addresses to Callow with attached notes indicating timeline pressure and buyer readiness. Thaddeus Blackwell convened a press conference in the lobby of his downtown building and expressed deep concern about the actions of certain employees who had operated outside the boundaries of anything his organization had authorized or condoned, and pledged full cooperation with every investigation. 2 hours after the press conference, Hayes's office released a set of financial authorizations from Blackwell Family Holdings, bearing his personal digital signature, approving by line item the consulting payments to the Sentinel Crest subsidiary that had been used to compensate Callow's network. The public hearing at City Council chambers was standing room only on a Thursday afternoon in March, and the footage from the warehouse drive was shown on the projection screen, without narration or introduction. The audience watched Douglas Farrell approach Naomi's table from behind while she read her phone, reach into the open top of her tote bag, and place the brown leather wallet inside it. They watched Voss on the exterior feed, standing on the sidewalk with his radio at his ear, waiting for a signal before pushing through the cafe door. They watched the interior camera feeds cut out at the exact moment logged in Sentinel Crest's remote access records. And they watched Naomi, hands visible, movements deliberate, voice controlled, being led through the room in handcuffs while the people around her stayed quiet. Blackwell's attorney attempted, during the open testimony portion of the hearing, to raise questions about the reliability of evidence sourced from an individual with no fixed address, a prior arrest record, and documented grievances against the very company whose footage was being presented. Gideon Price was seated at the witness table. He responded without raising his voice. He walked through the timestamp verification method, the technical specifications of the backup drive's write protocol, the chain of custody from the warehouse to the state inspector's evidence locker, and the firmware version of the camera system, a version he had installed personally and could describe in greater technical detail than anyone else in the room. He said, they were not afraid of him seeing what happened. They had simply calculated that no one would take seriously what a man in his position reported. The room was quiet after he finished, in the particular way of a room where something has just become impossible to deny. Naomi was asked by a council member why she had not accepted the settlement Blackwell offered. She said he wasn't proposing to repair the harm. He was proposing to purchase the right to continue causing it, with a different person next time. She said the amount had been large enough that she had thought about it for longer than she would like to admit, and that what had ended the thinking was a conversation with her daughter about what it means to need to prove you deserve to be believed. The legal outcomes moved through the federal system with the unhurried finality of cases that had been thoroughly documented before anyone was charged. Nolan Voss entered a guilty plea on charges of evidence planting, civil rights violation under color of law, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of constitutional rights. In exchange for his cooperation against the network's upper tier, he received a sentence his attorney characterized as proportionate, and that several of the 11 prior arrest victims characterized as insufficient, both of which were accurate in different ways. Brent Callow was indicted on 16 counts: conspiracy, bribery, filing of false official reports, witness intimidation, and directing the unlawful arrest of at least 7 individuals over a 26-month period, and accepted a federal agreement 3 months into the proceedings that resolved 2 counts and did nothing to restore the years his decisions had extracted from other people. Conrad Wexler resigned before his indictment was filed, retained 3 attorneys, and released a statement through a public relations firm, describing his situation as a case of institutional overreach he personally regretted, a formulation that satisfied no one who had been displaced from the neighborhood he had systematically devalued. Thaddeus Blackwell faced federal charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to deprive citizens of property rights through official coercion, and bribery of public officials, serious enough that the Blackwell Family Holdings Trust moved immediately to distance itself from the urban development subsidiary, a maneuver Hayes's office had anticipated and foreclosed through asset freeze orders filed the same morning the warrants executed. The mixed-use development project for the downtown corridor was suspended indefinitely pending review of every property acquisition in the zone, and the purchases made through the shell companies were referred to a restitution panel authorized to offer original owners the right of first refusal to repurchase at the original forced sale price. The City Council passed 3 resolutions within 60 days. A mandatory review of all active municipal contracts with private security firms, a requirement that all stops and field searches by uniformed officers be documented with written justification and retained for 5 years, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight panel with subpoena authority over police records and the power to refer findings directly to the state attorney general. The panel's first technical advisor appointment was a recommendation Naomi made formally in writing, and the name she submitted was Gideon Price. Naomi Raines was reinstated to her contract position and received a written apology from the nonprofit's board. She declined an offer from a regional news program to tell her story on camera. She declined a second offer from a documentary producer who said the experience deserved a wider audience. She spent the next several months helping draft the audit methodology for the new Community Oversight Office, which required more hours and paid considerably less, and was unlikely to result in any footage of her face. She sat her daughter down and told her, as plainly as she could manage, that being innocent was not always enough, that there were systems designed to make innocence look like guilt, and that the answer was not to trust that the truth would eventually surface on its own, but to preserve it carefully and make sure it reached the people who didn't have a reason to bury it. Marlo Bennett kept the cafe. She hung a small handwritten sign near the front door. Everyone who comes through this door deserves to be seen and treated with dignity. She converted the back corner into a monthly community legal clinic, and the table near the frost-edged window became a regular seat again, occupied now by a man in a cleaner jacket who paid for his coffee with his own wages and still kept the old radio on the table beside his cup. Months after the hearing, Naomi came back to Bell and Finch and sat at the same table where she had been handcuffed. Gideon came in a few minutes later, set the radio down between them, and when she asked why he still carried it, he said it reminded him that sometimes the only way the truth gets heard is if someone is patient enough to record it. Outside, a patrol car stopped at the corner traffic light. The officer inside glanced through the cafe window, and then the light changed and the car moved on, and no one in the room was asked to stand up, to step away from their belongings, or to prove they had any right to be exactly where they were. They had believed a man with no address had no voice worth hearing, but the one person no one thought to watch had been watching all along, and what he recorded made it impossible for anyone in that city to look away.